Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this conversation this afternoon with Dr. Debbie Bargallie, who's here to talk with us about her book, Unmasking the Racial Contract. Welcome, Debbie. Before we get going, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on today, the Yagara people of the regions south of the Brisbane River. I acknowledge we're on sovereign land, never ceded, and respect Aboriginal people as the traditional owners of the land we're all on today, stolen land, taken by force from the late 18th century onwards. I acknowledge the elders, past and present, and recognise their knowledge and wisdom. My name's Susan Forde. I'm Director of the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research, and I'm very pleased to welcome Debbie to this session today. I also acknowledge my colleague, Peter Grutenberg, the Director of the Griffith Institute for Educational Research, who's helped organise this event with us today. So welcome to this Dialogue with the Author event run during NAIDOC 2020 as part of our commitment to supporting and employing and mentoring Indigenous academics here at Griffith University, and particularly in the Arts, Education and Law group. And as is our NAIDOC theme for this year, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So to introduce you to Debbie. Dr. Debbie Bargallie is a Kamilaroi and Wonnarua woman from the areas of northwestern New South Wales and the Upper Hunter Valley. She worked for 14 years in the Australian Public Service, eventually resigning in 2013 after rising to the ranks of Senior Indigenous Advisor. She's completed her PhD at the Queensland University of Technology and is a Senior Postdoctoral Fellow with the Griffith Institute for Educational Research and closely affiliated with our centre, the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research. Debbie's first book, which we'll be talking about today, is Unmasking the Racial Contract, Indigenous Voices on Racism in the Australian Public Service, which won the prestigious 2019 Stanner Award for an unpublished manuscript and is now published with Aboriginal Studies Press to great reviews. She was the inaugural PhD candidate employed within the ARC-funded National Indigenous Knowledges and Research Network, NIRICN, led by distinguished Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson, and is the recipient of a 2019 Griffith University Postdoctoral Fellowship. We'll talk today about the key ideas and themes in Debbie's book. We'll try to understand the racial contract that exists within the Australian Public Service and in other institutions. And a big part of our event today will be interaction with the audience and questions from you. So please take note of anything you'd like to ask as our time goes on, and Debbie will address as many of your questions as she can in the second half of this talk. Firstly, we've offered Debbie some dedicated time to address you about her book, and then we'll move into a conversation for 20 minutes and we'll follow that up with questions from the floor and interaction from you. So for now, over to you, Deb.
Thanks very much, Susan. It's great to be here, and also thank you to Peter. I start by acknowledging today that I'm on the unceded lands of the Yagara peoples, and I also pay my respect to elders past and present. So the book is a result. The book Unmasking the Racial Contract is a result of my doctoral research project and thesis that examined everyday racism in the experiences of Indigenous employees in the Australian Public Service. So it became opportunistic for me, or I can't really say opportunistic, but it was a great opportunity for me to write this book as a result of winning the Stanner Award and at the same time winning a postdoctoral research fellowship. So this happened, only recently. It was published by Aboriginal Studies Press in June 2020, just gone, so it's fairly new. It's been quite a journey, quite exciting, but also a hectic time. The reason I wrote the book primarily was to firstly put out the voices of Indigenous employees, so to privilege the voices of Indigenous employees who participate in the research project and who I consider to be co-theorists in the journey with me. And the second, and probably also a major reason, is to expose an organisation who considers themselves to be a meritocracy, which is not really what we've seen when it comes to speaking with Indigenous employees in the course of this research. So it's quite a thick book. It was a big thesis, and trying to write it down into a book was difficult to try and work out how it's going to capture the experience of Indigenous employees, privilege their voices without losing too much of their story. So the way I did this is that I developed the book in 3 parts. Part A, Part B and Part C. So what I'm going to do now is just briefly talk to some of those parts without going into too much detail, and also speak to some of the comments that are actually presented in the book itself. So in Part A, Understanding Racism Through Lived Experiences, I predominantly set the book up in terms of talking through my methodological approach here. So I start in the introduction by addressing the research problem. And the reason I've set this up this way is because distinguished Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson tells us that, and teaches us that, Indigenous research methodologies always consist of standpoint, conceptual / theoretical framework and methods. And that's the way I've laid out Part A. So in looking at addressing the research project and talking about what the problem is, I start with a quote from a participant 3 who participated in the research. The comment that this person put forward I found really compelling, and that's why I put it up front in the introduction. So to quote this person, "One of the things I've always grappled with in the public service was that it was never clear to me why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were important in the first place." And that pretty much sets up what many people were articulating through speaking through their experiences. So in working out where I was going with this particular chapter, I led out by speaking about Charles Perkins. I consider Charles Perkins to be, the quintessential situated knower, in that he's one of Australia's probably best known Indigenous employees or Aboriginal employees, and rose to the senior ranks. In talking about Charles Perkins, he has spoken about his experiences in the public service through his own biography, through a book called
Peter Reid's biography.
Yeah, Peter Reid's biography, and also his own book, Bastard Like Me. So he gives quite a detailed description of his experiences in the public service. But Perkins entered the public service as a graduate and was the only Aboriginal graduate in the office at the time. He began his work in about 1969 after the 1967 referendum, and he was the only graduate in his office. So I'm just going to read a little bit here what I've written about, which I've taken from his experiences. He's living in Canberra, owning a car, buying a house and wearing his neat suit and white shirt. Perkins seemed to be the typical bureaucrat, but was a long way from being an insider, Reid writes. His appearance and the colour of his skin threw his fellow colleagues out. He was deemed too white to be black and too black to be white, and he never felt a sense of belonging in the bureaucracy. His white colleagues saw him as someone trying to be what he could not be, but he was not considered to be a real Aborigine either. Perkins described his work experience, or his experiences working in the Office of Aboriginal Affairs, as shattering and demoralising. And for the first 6 months, he felt that people set out to deliberately show me where I belonged or should belong, and to make me feel completely an inferior person, a non-entity in Aboriginal affairs. He was disappointed. He talked about working with people in Aboriginal affairs who knew nothing about Aboriginal affairs, and he claimed that first year in Aboriginal affairs was deliberately meant to humiliate me, shut me up and make me conform. He felt that he was bought out by the public service, in his being brought into the public service, coming from being a political activist. So Perkins Experiences set me up to think more about the experiences that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as Indigenous employees were experiencing in the public service. And being in the system for 14 years myself, I'd had these conversations on a daily basis. So I'd already been informed about what's been going on in the public service, and we know these conversations intimately, and they were had on a daily basis, which was also one of the reasons that led me to do the research in the first place. So in terms of writing this book and setting up the methodology section, I talked to Standpoint by using distinguished Professor Morton Robinson's Australian Indigenous Woman Standpoint theory, where I talked to my experiences as an Aboriginal woman through the story of my family as Bargallie mob. I also speak in detail about my own experiences as an Indigenous employee, and also some of those experiences and the way I was set up, particularly in terms of being positioned as the angry Black woman. So I'm just going to read you a section that I write here about that. So on page 44, I write, a classic comment to me is, you always come across as an angry woman. During a supervision meeting, one female white supervisor gave me a book titled The Angry Book, which discusses the physical and emotional consequences of suppressed anger. This just made me angrier. I sat there thinking, you want to see angry? How about we talk about anger derived from oppressive behaviours? Now that's what makes me angry. I've since learned about the trope of the angry Black woman and how this label is attached to Aboriginal women who dare to be assertive or to talk up, particularly around racism. Aboriginal women's voices are often marginalised and silenced, and Aboriginal women who voice their concerns, especially about racism, are stereotyped and positioned as naturally angry, aggressive, bad-mannered or bad-tempered. Being accused of being angry can come from simply holding non-Indigenous people accountable in the workplace. Sarah Ahmed, 2010, aptly described the phenomena of the angry Black woman as a killjoy facing the walls of racism and sexism. So that's how I was positioned, unfortunately, as the angry Black woman, and probably still do today when I speak out. Like many of us that do this type of work get positioned. So to understand contemporary experiences of racism in the Australian public service, or any contemporary experiences of racism, one must understand, or it is imperative to understand, how race impacts people in the Australian historical context, and particular Aboriginal peoples. So in the first part A of the book, I go to great lengths to try to establish a good understanding of Australia as a racial state, how they come into play through establishing the racial state and the Australian public service. And I particularly focus on the setup of the Australian public service in terms of, their commitment to merit-based processes, where merit's used as a guiding principle. And I also look at some detailed literature around racism and Indigenous employment. Particularly in that early phases, I also speak quite heavily around the theory, and people question, about how much I've talked about theory in terms of this book, but I do this because we don't have a lot of race scholarship published in Australia at the moment. Distinguished Professor Aileen Morton Robinson's probably led the way for this in terms of Australian academics, and she's known internationally for her work. So I took this opportunity to really showcase how we can operationalise race as a critical critical category of analysis in research. In part B, I concentrate on privileging Indigenous voices, and I take 4 chapters to do that. In those 4 chapters, I advance, Professor Lester Iribina-Rigney's work in terms of his core three interrelated principles of Indigenous research, and particularly privileging Indigenous voices, it was really hard for me to capture so much qualitative research through 21 yarning sessions with extensive transcripts, thick transcripts, and working out how to use that, all of that work. And I felt really compromised in actually cutting that work up. So I tried to provide in this part not only their voices, but I provided two portraits of more complete experiences of two particular Indigenous employees. Working through that a little further, across those 4 chapters towards the end, I talk about how Indigenous employees are not passive victims of racism, but they actually work together in forms of solidarity, resistance, and survival in order to actually get through those experiences in the system. Throughout those 4 chapters that I talk about there, I also develop a taxonomy of racial microaggressions, which actually speaks to those experiences of Indigenous employees on a day-to-day basis, which are structurally and interpersonally experienced racism forms in forms of racism that are both structurally and interpersonal racism, and they work together to suppress and oppress Indigenous employees. I also talk about, you know, how Indigenous employees approach racism and trying to tackling this, you know, race head on. Part C, I talked to briefly around about how I think we could go about dismantling racism at work, and look at primarily around how to break that racial silence, which is not really talked about in the public service. I look at structural changes towards dismantling that business as usual racism, and I also look at how we can restructure the terms of Indigenous inclusion in the Australian public service. And primarily when I finish off with a comment by a participant, which really drives home the nature of, you know, of what we're talking about here with this book. And I'll just quote this. First of all, I write that Indigenous employees have paid and continue to pay a high price for racism. As agents of knowledge and as situated as knowers, whether we opt to stay in the APS or opt to leave, we're still here and will continue to tell our stories. This is Indigenous resistance. So I finish with a comment that I regard by a participant as a call to arms for the APS to take action to address racism. This participant writes, look, by and large, I love working in the APS. I love being able to make changes for our communities. I love being able to see the footprint of what we can actually do. However, we are at a critical point for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And statistics keep getting worse and worse and worse. And everyone says they don't know what to do about it. But all we need is action. We need action, commitment, a voice at the table, and accountability. If people are really committed, they dedicate and commit to action. If you're really committed to action, be accountable for the delivery on it. If Aboriginal employment and development is really part of the government's policy, why aren't the managers being held to account? So I'll end my little talk here by asking and repeating a question that the late Black American writer and activist James Baldwin asked over 30 odd years ago to the APS. How much time do you want for your progress? Thank you, Susan. Over to you.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you very much. Terrific. And I hope everybody's received their link as well, so that if you don't have Unmasking the Racial Contract yet, you can get it at a discounted price if you're one of our registered audience today. So, Deb, we're going to just talk for a little while now, and then we'll open up for questions. So audience members, do feel free to send your questions through. We have Kim here who'll be sending those through to Debbie and I as they come in. I do want to go back to some of the issues in the book though, so we can tease some of it out a little bit. And you've talked just now and in the start of the book as well about Charles Perkins and you've relied on his biography and Perkins' own work to understand those very early experiences that he had in the Australian public service. Perkins says at one point that he feels his being recruited to the APS was, in his words, being bought out or being bought off. Can you talk a little bit about this? I mean, it's a complex issue, both in terms of how the individual person may feel about moving into that structure, but also how they're being perceived by their own community. Is this tension between, a real community Indigenous person and being one who works within the white system still prevalent in the way that it was for Perkins in the 60s? Is this still a struggle to overcome, do you think?
So to start with Perkins's experience, he entered in 1969, so following the referendum. But Charles Perkins was already established as a political activist. And he sort of found it very difficult to enter there and also be expected to leave behind his activism. And over many years, he was suppressed. He was subjected to all sorts of inquiries, anything to control him. He was stopped from travelling out to Aboriginal communities at one stage as well. So there was many of those sorts of controls placed on Perkins. That being said, Perkins also had a lot of power as well because he was an influencer. So it was difficult for him to find that balance. So in terms of Indigenous employees today, I guess there's a couple of things that play there. Is that Indigenous employees say that they enter the public service. Predominantly, people talk about entering the public service because they want to make a difference and make a difference for their mob and for home communities. And many people have that fire in the belly to do that. But unfortunately, when you hit the public service, a lot of that fire in the belly gets stamped out. So people often also feel that pressure and reported to me that pressure about the work that community would expect them to do or accountable to community, but the role of the public servant is to deliver the direction of the ministers, the secretaries and the government of the day. So, have very limited power in terms of, meeting that community expectation. And similarly, one participant spoke to me about being in a position where this person had to go overseas and was painted out to have to stand at the front of a international entourage and be made out to be the token Aborigine that supports this government in the ways it is. And she felt very uneasy and very embarrassed because we know very well back at home that things aren't as great as what government was making it out to be. So there is that I'd say play between feeling that you're in there to make a difference and to carry out work for mob and work for community, but not being able to do so, which leaves many people choosing to leave the public service.
And I think part of that as well, and you talk about that issue of power and whether these people really have the power to do something. And a lot of that's related to the fact that, in most of our institutions, some of the most senior roles in Indigenous affairs are held by non-Indigenous people. And you talk about that in your book, that, so many people are at the bottom rung of the ladder, even though they're employed. So do you feel your experiences and perhaps Perkins' early experiences would have been different with Indigenous people in more senior roles? Or is it the case that the impact of structural and systemic racism neutralises such people so that even if they are in senior roles, the impact is more neutralised?
Good question. So we all want to see more Aboriginal people in positions in the public service, in the university sector, everywhere, and in particular in higher positions as well. Yet this whole idea that we can just add some Aborigines to the mix and stir and everything will get better, has to be really thought through and questioned. The reality is that we can have more people at the top, but does it really make a major difference until other structures and processes and laws and legislations actually change? So yes, I think that there is a preference to get more people in, but I think there's more of a preference to actually make some solid structural changes to the APS, to the Constitution, to lots of other things that actually drive the APS.
Yeah, all right. And you talk about, and some of the things I guess that the workers that you spoke about came across as well, you talk about the absent presence of racism. This relates to the denial of racism and also Stanner's notion, the cult of forgetfulness that he says Australia has practiced on a national scale. So can you talk a little bit about how racism in the public service to you is an absent presence and how your interviewees enunciated that as well? Okay, so obviously the interviewees or my co-theorists didn't use the term absent presence, but I use the term absent presence in the book and through my research to explain this whole denial of racism, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as you'll read throughout the 4 chapters of the book, clearly speak to experiences of racism on a daily basis, which I say every day in every way, through series of racial microaggressions, through behaviours, through merit-based processes, through cultural cloning, through all of these sorts of experiences. Yet they're largely denied. And it's not surprising that these experiences are denied because, denial is a key feature of racism in Australia. So what I'm trying to say is that, there's this absent presence where Indigenous employees are saying that racism is there, it's every day in every way, it's overt, it's covert, it's structural, it's interpersonal, which work together. Yet it's largely denied, so it's absent and present at the same time. So that's my quick way of explaining that. Thank you. I have another one.
Okay.
You mentioned racial microaggressions.
Yep.
Can you give us an idea of the role of these actions, these racial microaggressions, in forming the racial contract? And what are some common bases of racial microaggressions? What does it look like, and perhaps what does it feel like?
Okay, so to understand that, you would probably need to understand the racial contract, and the racial contract is an abstract way of thinking about, racial advantage and racial disadvantage. So it's seen as to be a contract that privileges, in the Australian context, non-Indigenous peoples over Indigenous people. So it's unfair advantages to non-Indigenous peoples. And in my context of my research, it's with non-Indigenous public servants. So racial microaggressions are daily, everyday acts, behaviours. They are in a variety of ways, and the purpose is to maintain white supremacy. Really, it keeps Indigenous employees down, oppressed, maintained, keeps them in their place. And and you'll see in my book, I provide a taxonomy, and just to name a couple of racial microaggressions that identified. I talk about Indigenous as deficit as a racial microaggression. I talk about this concept of cultural cloning, this idea of this systematic reproduction of sameness that's evident through the struggle for Indigenous employees, to reach middle and senior leadership positions at the same rate as their non-Indigenous colleagues. I talk about this racial silencing and pigeonholing, where Indigenous employees speak about being positioned only in Indigenous type roles and feel that they are pigeonholed and therefore not really seen to be worthy or necessary in mainstream type areas. I talk about this pathologising of cultural values as a racial microaggression. The denial of racism is another version, and also the myth of meritocracy. And another particular one is this whole denying of indigeneity. So this expectation that Indigenous employees need to leave their indigeneity at the door when they're actually working within the spaces of the Australian public service. So there's some examples of how, you know, racism is maintained. Yeah.
And the book is, I mean, you've touched on a few things there particularly, but the book is really rich in theory, and I know a number of people have said this to you, and some reviews that are coming out do talk about the depth of the book. You draw on Morton Robinson's work, which you've referred to generally here, both methodologically and theoretically. And just for everyone, I'll just go through very briefly some of the key people and theories that are coming through. Lester Ridney's work about Indigenous research, of course, Mill's work on the racial contract, Philomena Essed's work on everyday racism, Dubois' concept of double consciousness, Fannon's work on lateral violence, and so on. It feels like we're very late to the party. In reading your book, it feels like we're very late to the party on race and race theory in Australia, and in discussing the impact of racism within our society and on people's lives. Is there a place that you look to where you think a nation or society is more advanced with their understanding of race, with anti-racism, and perhaps even with dismantling racist structures?
Well, it's a big question. So in terms of Australia, I've already talked about that. You know, primarily I utilise the work of distinguished Professor Aileen Morton Robinson, who leads the way with race scholarship in Australia, and that also leads the way internationally in terms of some of that work as well. It's hard to know where I'd say I would draw the most from and who's made the most changes. I mean, obviously in the United States of America, they've produced race scholarship for a long time. And they've produced some of the classic stuff, which I also used in my book, being through Charles Mills and Philomena Ested, and also with the theorists that I used around racial microaggressions. So I drawed heavily on a lot of that research. I think that it's fair to say that I'm probably most excited about some of the work that actually comes out of the UK, and I get a buzz out of seeing the way that, you know, some of the critical race scholars, race critical scholars in the UK are doing some of this work, which, you know, problematizes the motherland, or the, you know, the mothership of the empire. And work in the UK also, historically, they had leaders like, you know, the Jamaican, you know, British sociologist Stuart Hall. He was also, you know, a critical theorist and cultural theorist. Still today is Paul Gilroy and his work, and predominantly also the work around anti-racism and racism by Amber, but I can never say his name properly, so we'll call him Asif Anandam. And, you know, his work, particularly around racial awareness training and anti-racism. But in looking through some of the scholarship over there, you've got the likes of Gargi Bhattacharya in racial capitalism. We've got the Black feminist scholar on race and gender, Heidi Safia Mercer. I mean, Nirmal Pua wrote Space Invaders, which used the racial contract as well to examine, you know, the meaning of diversity in the workplace for and organisations, you know, within the nation state or within, you know, the halls of Westminster and Whitehall. We've got critical race theorists in the UK like Nicola Rollock, who works on racial justice and in education and the workplace, but also, you know, we've got recently obviously works come out by, you know, Kawan Bongpal in white privilege, and Priyamvada Gopal, and the list goes on. Angela Saini, you know, and we can't leave out, you know, the work by the British Australian critical race theorist and intersectional feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed. But so there's so many. I mean, there's, you know, non-Indigenous workers over there working in those spaces like, you know, Steve Garner, Richard Dyer, the educationalists, critical race theorist David Gilbourne, and more upcoming scholars like Ali Meghji, Remy Salisbury, Stephen Ash, Katie Sian, Sarah Salem, and of course our friend that we had here last year, Gavin Titley, in Racism and Media. And Irish scholars such as the Nigerian Irish scholar Ibn Joseph, And also, finally, I can't leave out Alana Linton, who's the European, West Asian, Jewish race scholar who's currently based in Australia. So that's where I sort of like am currently liking the scholarship that's coming out of the UK.
Yeah. Sounds like you've either got a lot to read or you've
I've read it.
done it all.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm conscious of time. I'm going to pretty much give you one more question and then we'll hear from the audience. So please do send your questions through so that we can have some interaction from you with Deb. And it's something that you've touched on also just now about non-Indigenous researchers who might be working in this space. So the place and role of non-Indigenous researchers in research about Indigenous people, research for Indigenous people and communities, and then of course we go to research with Indigenous people and communities, and the notion of Indigenous research and the integration of Indigenous standpoint, etc. in research. Can you talk about that? Because in Australia, this is something we see a lot, non-Indigenous researchers working on these issues. What are the pitfalls that you see there? What are the ways that those people who are working in this space can really be doing this work properly for the betterment of all?
Okay, tricky question. So first of all, I'd probably start off by using a comment that we use quite widely and we repeat from New Zealand Māori scholar Graham Smith.
Okay.
And he says, it's not about us without us. Yeah. So where I'd probably like to go with saying that is that there should be no reason today that Indigenous research is not Indigenous-led research and Indigenous-centred research. There should be no reason today that research teams are predominantly non-Indigenous peoples and led by non-Indigenous peoples. And there is a role for non-Indigenous peoples in participating in Indigenous research, except that they need to learn to take a step back and, be led by Indigenous peoples and centre Indigenous, understandings, and also, allow Indigenous people to set their own agenda, Indigenous communities, Indigenous scholars to set, the political agenda, the research agenda, and that's that's where Professor Susan comes from when he talks about Indigenous research frameworks. He talks about, the political imperative, political integrity in the research project. So I actually find a little bit problematic this whole any Aborigine will do sort of behaviour that goes on with non-Indigenous peoples in research projects that grab a particular Indigenous person, whether it's an early career scholar or even, an undergrad or somebody, just to be on that research project that has no other role than being the Aboriginal person on the project because it's what they need to do to attract research monies or to be seen to be doing Indigenous research. I also see this when I'm looking at research ethic applications that come through. I see an odd name thrown on to a research application for the point of getting it through an Indigenous ethics process, where I know that scholar or that person and know that that person has no role to play in that or no real experience to bring to that point. So, it is problematic, and it's problematic in the same way, and it's always a touchy a subject, but it's problematic in the same way that Indigenous employees talked about in a section in my book where they Indigenous employees talk about also non-Indigenous employees taking leadership positions without the experiences and knowledges to do so and to take up those positions and deliver on those positions. And also we see it in the academy. I mean, we see non-Indigenous peoples being coercing people to take these sorts of roles. Yeah, it's pretty problematic. And I mean, I guess also, you know, one issue is also Indigenous peoples also have to, you know, take a stance and take a position and, you know, make a decision themselves and not feel coerced to be in things that they don't think that is kosher and that they aren't being a part of from the beginning to the end. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. We do have some questions coming in here, so I'm going to read off the screen, Deb, and just we'll go through them. Thanks very much, David Ellison. Very interesting talk, he says. Given the Morrison government's emphatic refusal to acknowledge the reality of structural racism and their discomfort with affirmative action, how do they account for the need for additional Indigenous Australians at senior levels of the APS? What kind of language do they draw upon to explain this initiative?
Yeah, really interesting question. We haven't seen a government in Australia yet take responsibility for structural racism. We see, you know, language used like, you know, bias and stuff in terms of talking about racism. We look at, you know, training being around unconscious bias, which is, you know, it places then racism on individuals rather than being looking at the institutional. So it keeps a gaze off the institution. One of the problems is in terms of there has never been a real great focus in bringing people into the APS at more senior roles. And I hear now that there's a couple of training programs going on where they're really starting to concentrate on keeping Indigenous employees and bringing people in. But there's also an issue around why are we not bringing up the Indigenous people that that are still sitting on the lower rungs of that ladder, you know, why those people left afloat there for so long. So that's a problem in and of itself. Much of the employment initiatives are based around lower level, you know, Indigenous employees. So yeah, you raise a really good point there, and one that's people are constantly pushing to try and deal with. But you know, the government needs to take responsibility for structural racism, accept that it exists, and then actually start to work with changes to make the APS operation, deliver the role of government in different ways through anti-racist praxis.
Thank you. Very good. We have a question here from Ann Donis, one of our history postdoc fellows. Thank you and congratulations on your book. And Donna says, I grew up in Canberra and am acutely aware of the racialist culture that is prevalent in the city and the APS more generally. I'm wondering if your research revealed any differences in departmental culture in the attitudes or microaggressions across the APS. For example, DFAT compared to the Department of Health and Ageing. Is there a department that stands out as acting better or worse than others when it comes to institutional racism in the Australian public service?
Okay, so Ann Donna, thank you for your question. To start with, I guess what I didn't say, which I should say in terms of what I've had to present in this book, is that it's important to read what is not being said as much as it is to read what is being said. I had to go to great lengths to make sure that individual departments are not recognised, that potential perpetrators could not recognise themselves by articulating the experiences told to me from Indigenous employees. So that's really problematic because we know that, being named as a racist or being called racist is more problematic than the act itself. So I can't say whether one is any better than the other. All I can say is that across those 4 chapters that you can read in my book, you will see that those people represent a variety of departments. I mean, as much as I interviewed 21 participants through quite detailed yarning sessions, they were from a variety of departments.
Was there a sense within any of that, just to follow on from that question really, was there a sense in any of the interviews you've done, or even in your own experience as a public servant for a long time, that, you know, we would hope people working at least within the DAA, or the equivalent of the old DAA, Department of Aboriginal Affairs, or Department of Indigenous Affairs, or Indigenous communities, etc., that things might not be so problematic within that specific department? Is that anyone's experience, or is it just as problematic as Treasury or DFAT?
It's the Australian Public Service, and it's all problematic. The majority of people that I spoke to in my research worked across many departments. We don't often go in and remain in one department, you know, across all of our, you know, working lives. In the 14 years that I worked in the department, I worked across a variety of departments, you know, and I worked in, you know, areas of, you know, education, employment, health, law and justice, so across a gamut of departments. So, I mean, yeah, we're delusional to think that there's any department that escapes this behaviour, these behaviours, this racism.
All right, good, thank you. We have a question from Indy. Thank you, Indigo. Where are some, thank you for the great talk, Debbie, she says, where are some of the interdisciplinary or expanded areas in academia that you feel your book can create important conversations within, but may not immediately be considered? Sociology, of course, but any other disciplines, for example, you know, business, political science, criminology, sports? Yeah,
absolutely, Indy. Look, you know, I consider myself to be an interdisciplinary scholar, so I work across, you know, a variety of disciplinary areas, but race is largely absent in studies across Australia as it is. So there's really no race studies in this country, and this is what distinguished Professor Ali Morton-Robinson's always calling out. We do not do race studies in Australia, and this is one of our major problems. So, look, seriously, if any area, you know, whether it's education, whether it's history, you know, whichever area it is, health, people always can benefit from understanding race scholarship, particularly in terms of the way race scholarship is used to interrogate racism for Indigenous peoples and other peoples in Australia. You know, it can be benefited across many disciplinary areas.
Which is, you know, the way that everything's heading to with academia, is being able to work across and be relevant in so many areas. Create large teams that can be dealing with big problems.
Yeah, and I produced this piece of work, you know, as a, you know, with coming from a social science discipline background, but also sitting in education now. But, you know, I speak to a lot of different areas about this work, and a lot of people have reached out from, you know, different areas. And, you know, one thing about this piece of work too is that since I've published, and it comes back to what you know, we were talking about earlier, since I've published, I receive emails from Indigenous employees all across the country. And, you know, I feel brokenhearted, you know, because, I mean, I described my experiences as killing me softly, and people just talk about it being get away through systemic and everyday racism on a daily basis, and having no voice or no outlet or no place to be heard. And it's really gut-wrenching.
We've got a question too from Paolo. Thank you, Paolo. She says, thanks for a great presentation. I really like your points about the democratic right of Indigenous people to set their own research agenda, to design their research studies, and for Indigenous folk to be the lead investigators on research projects. However, topics such as everyday racism, structural racism, and so on seem to get incorporated in discourses of cultural competence, cultural understanding, cultural frameworks, or cultural safety. Can you talk to these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Paolo. And you're absolutely correct. And this is the way not only, you know, research in the institution works, but also, you know, in terms of the Australian Public Service. You know, as you know, those of us that, you know, research in the space of race and racism, we know that race is quite, well, you know, most often left out as a category of analysis, with a preference to be towards, centering culture and centering gender, which is, more safe space for people rather than speaking about race, because, of the misunderstandings of race, and also because most people don't consider themselves, to be a race. The white race is the normal. So, in discourses of cultural competence, the Australian Public Service, and I know the university sector also, positions, reconciliation action plans and cultural competency and cultural safety frameworks and all of those things as a way to address racism, but they can't actually address racism. They're not capable of doing that work. Yeah, the failure to centre race doesn't do that work, nor does dealing with unconscious bias.
And I will point readers, there is a really good discussion in the book about the notion of cultural awareness training and cultural competency and that kind of thing, which is useful for all of us to read.
Yeah, well, my point is that these things fail to unmask racism.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Tonya. Hi, Debbie. Thank you for your amazing presentation and for saying the things that, as an Aboriginal academic, like my brothers and sisters, face on a daily basis, particularly as educated Aboriginal people. I'm wondering if you've found that Aboriginal workers are mainly found in the lowest paid and lowest classification jobs, yet burdened with the highest expectations around everything Aboriginal in white workplaces.
Absolutely, and those comments are made right throughout the book in terms of Indigenous employees, mostly contained at the mid to lower rungs of the ladder, but with the additional burden of doing the unpaid labour that's expected to train non-Indigenous peoples around jobs. One talks about always being the bridesmaid, never the bride. So it's okay for an Indigenous employee to continually train up non-Indigenous employees, but never good enough to be in those positions. Other people talk about, continually, acting in positions for extensive periods of time, yet never being positioned as, good enough to win those positions. And one of the participants says, if you look at the history of identified positions in the Australian Public Service, you will find that the majority have gone to white people. So, yes, you're correct. There's people talk about, and back to this whole thing I said before, any Aboriginal will do, is there's this expectation of Aboriginal people to be experts across absolutely everything to do with anything Indigenous. And, it just doesn't cut it. But most importantly, those things are usually only around cultural type things. So if it was policy inclusion or something else, the Indigenous participants talk about being left outside and excluded for conversations around, policy program development, implementation, funding, those sorts of things. But yet they're all called in when it's NAIDOC weekend. Everybody wants to know what events that they can do for NAIDOC Day, or this expectation that Indigenous employees develop and deliver on reconciliation action plans, which are largely non-performative, which I speak about in some detail in the book. So Tonya, you're absolutely right with that.
And a lot of it is, as you said, it's about not really doing the substantive work, but coming in to do the performative work.
The performative work,
tokenistic. Now we're nearly at time, but I wanted to ask, because we've spoken so much about the experiences that your interviews reported to you. So I'm wondering, did any of the people that you spoke to, they've all generally reported to you that they went in with this motivation to do well for their communities, to have impact, to improve things for their own families, but also for their broader mobs, Aboriginal people generally. Did any of the people that you spoke to after a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years in the public service feel like they had made ground, that they had achieved things, that they had been able to change things either within their area or for people, for community?
Yeah, good question. yes, all Indigenous employees, like I said, spoke about the reason for going into the public service is for primarily to make a difference for mob. And I think that nearly every person spoke about that burning desire to do that. And everybody did speak to me about having that real burning passion when they first go in there as well. And people I spoke with were across, various levels, from the lower end to before you hit the senior executive part of the ladder. So before you cross that wall there. So people talk about everybody's experience in the public service, first I must say, is different. Every Indigenous employee has different experiences. And there are some people that feel like, and even myself, work in programs where we think, oh my God, this is great. And it's such a great feeling to feel like you've done something special. I mean, I worked in the Northern Territory before they rolled out the Northern Territory emergency response. I worked, with night patrols and funding services out there, and it was brilliant, some of the outcomes and working with community. And then they rolled out the Northern Territory intervention, and I just wanted to bury my head in the sand. It was just embarrassing. So people opt in and out all the time. Some people stay for the period. Some people opt out and get some, because they respite care. Some people come out to look after themselves and go back in, and other people stay. And even those people who stay, I mean, those people are also in this book, so all their comments are, put in here together. So people do believe that they have opportunities to make a difference, but overall they feel that there are so many barriers that are placed in their way to actually make a big difference overall.
Thanks, Deb. Look, I'm very conscious that we are at time. So I want to, on behalf of everybody who's listening and all the members of our centre and the university, thank Debbie Bargallie very much for being with us today and talking about your book. It's absolutely fantastic. A small housekeeping, it's not even a housekeeping matter, a note that we have another event coming up on Thursday. We are in NAIDOC week, and we have another event coming up on Thursday, which is our First Nations Research Showcase, which will be presenting 3 of the newest Indigenous academics working within the Arts Education Law Group to speak about their research. So if you haven't received your email about that, contact Kim Podger from our centre and she will be able to send it to you. It will be great if some people can come along to that one as well to meet some of our newest academics. In the meantime, thanks again, Debbie. Thanks very much to Kim Podger, who's behind the camera here, helping us today with everything. And have a wonderful Monday afternoon, everyone. Have a great NAIDOC week. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.